what if the reason you feel just constantly overwhelmed by the news isn't because the world is actually getting worse, but because the biological hardware of your brain is literally being outpaced by the speed of global infrastructure?
Yeah, I mean, think about that for a second. You wake up, you check your phone, and before you've even, had your first cup of coffee, you're expected to process a geopolitical crisis, a macroeconomic fluctuation, a climate anomaly, and like a massive breakthrough in artificial intelligence.
Right. It feels completely exhausting. And today, for this deep dive, we're going to look at a framework that argues this exhaustion you're feeling is not a personal failing. It's actually a structural, engineered feature of the modern world.
It really is the defining architectural reality of our time. And to understand the mechanics behind why we feel that exhaustion, we are unpacking a highly conceptual, honestly incredibly dense text today. It's titled The Architecture of Global Acceleration and Perceptual Decay.
Yeah, it's quite a title.
It is, and it's one of the most clinical, unsentimental analyses I've ever read regarding why our systems feel like they're just, spinning completely out of control.
We are going to go through this text piece by piece, but I think we really have to start with the core thesis here. The entire document rests on this massive systemic tension between two opposing forces.
Right.
On one side, we have what the author calls our widening global fields. And this refers to like the literal physical footprint of our planetary systems, the unbelievable reach of our technological networks, and the sheer scale of our interconnected global economy.
Which are, expanding.
Exactly. These fields are widening at a breathtaking exponential pace.
And then on the other side of that tension is human biology. The text introduces this concept of narrowing human perceptual bandwidth.
Narrowing bandwidth.
Right. So you have the infrastructure of the world pulling outward, vastly expanding, while our cognitive capacity to actually accurately perceive that world is functionally shrinking.
Okay, I want to push back on that immediately. I think it runs counter to how most of us view the modern era. I mean, shouldn't our perception be widening?
How do you mean?
Well, we have smartphones in our pockets that connect us to almost every piece of recorded human knowledge. We have, massive data centers, satellite imagery, real-time reporting from across the globe. By any metric, we have more access to information than any generation in human history. So shouldn't our bandwidth be the widest it has ever been?
Yeah, that is the fundamental paradox of the information age, right? And the text actually addresses this directly. Access to data is not synonymous with perceptual bandwidth.
Oh, interesting. So they're two different things.
Completely different. Bandwidth, in this context, is your cognitive capacity to process, synthesize, and accurately map that data into a coherent, functional understanding of reality. Having a fire hose of raw data pointed at your face doesn't mean you are drinking more water. It just means you're drowning.
Okay, that makes sense. So the text uses this phrase, perceptual decay. Does that mean we are actually losing cognitive ability? Like, are we getting less intelligent as a species?
Emphatically, no. The text is very clear that human intelligence is not failing. We aren't losing IQ points or anything like that. Our brains are essentially identical to the brains of humans living, 10,000 years ago.
Right.
Perceptual decay is a term of relativity. As our created systems expand exponentially in size, speed, and complexity, those widening fields we talked about, our fixed biological capacity to comprehend, the whole picture shrinks in proportion.
I see.
The total volume of reality we can accurately model in our minds is decaying relative to the total volume of reality that actually exists out there.
So it's really an issue of scale. Let's try to visualize this. Is it like, imagine walking into an IMAX theater, but you are forced to sit in the absolute front row.
Oh yeah, that's a great way to think about it.
Right. Because the screen is massive, it wraps entirely around your peripheral vision, and it is displaying incredibly high definition data. You technically have access to all of this visual information.
But you can't see it all.
Exactly. Because the screen is so vast and you're so close to it. The part of your retina that actually processes sharp detail, the fovea, I think it's called, can only focus on one tiny square of that screen at any given moment.
That is a highly accurate mechanical representation. The sheer scale of the global field literally forces a narrowing of your functional perception.
Right. So if you were looking at, let's say, the top left corner of the IMAX screen to understand a global supply chain issue, you are completely structurally blind to the bottom right corner where a climate anomaly is developing.
Yes.
You're forced to miss like 95% of the movie precisely because the screen is so large. And the wider they make the screen, the more violently you have to whip your head back and forth just to try and synthesize a basic narrative.
Which is cognitively exhausting. I mean, you feel it in your daily life. But the text takes this a step further. The IMAX screen isn't just massive. It is in motion.
What do you mean by in motion?
The actual fabric of the screen is shifting, the projector is accelerating, and crucially, different parts of the image are playing at different frame rates.
Wow. Okay, let's unpack this, because that brings us to the first of the 4 specific structural layers the text outlines to explain this architecture.
Yes, it does.
Look into the mechanics of that. The text labels this first layer asynchronous acceleration across technological domains.
Asynchronous is really the operative word here. We hear constantly about the acceleration of technology, right? Moore's law, exponential growth, AI capabilities doubling every few months.
Right, the world is speeding up.
But the structural danger identified in the text isn't simply that technology is getting faster. The real danger is that the acceleration is entirely out of sync. Different domains of human infrastructure are accelerating at wildly different velocities.
Meaning, we are not moving into the future as a single cohesive unit.
Not even close. Think about the physical world versus the digital world. You have information processing, artificial intelligence, and digital finance. These domains are largely untethered from physical mass.
Right, they're just data.
Exactly. They move at the speed of light through fiber optic cables. Software can be updated globally in an afternoon. This domain is accelerating on a steep exponential curve. But then, look at the physical logistics required to actually support that software.
The tangible stuff. Cargo ships, concrete pouring, copper mining.
Yes, the world of atoms. Physical logistics might be accelerating too, but they are permanently bound by the laws of thermodynamics, physical friction, and gravity. They accelerate on a linear curve.
Because you can't just download a new highway.
Precisely. And beneath both of those layers, you have the foundational energy grid. Power generation, high-voltage transmission lines, nuclear reactors.
Right.
That domain operates on an even slower, decades-long acceleration curve because of immense capital requirements, regulatory permitting, and just massive physical construction timelines.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. If I'm tracking this, we basically have a global machine with 3 primary gears. The digital gear is spinning at, let's say, 10,000 revolutions per minute.
Right.
The logistics gear is spinning at maybe 100 RPM, and the energy gear is barely turning at 10 RPM.
And they are all interlocked. This is where the structural tension becomes hypercritical. What happens to a physical machine when its internal components are forced to move at radically different velocities?
They grind against each other.
Exactly. If information processing accelerates infinitely faster than physical logistics, the parts of the global machine can no longer mesh smoothly. The gears begin to slip.
Let's put a concrete real-world example to this, because the theory makes sense, but I want to see how it plays out on the ground for, the listener. How does the digital gear physically grind against the energy gear?
Well, look at the deployment of large language models and artificial intelligence over the last few years. The software models themselves scaled up incredibly fast. An AI company can decide to double its compute power, and from a software perspective, that requires, a few keystrokes to spin up new virtual instances.
That was code.
Right. The digital domain demands immediate acceleration. But to physically execute that software command, a vast data center needs to draw megawatts of power from the local energy grid.
And the grid can't just be updated with a software patch.
Precisely. Upgrading a regional power grid to handle that sudden, massive spike in baseload demand requires laying new, high-capacity transmission lines, which involves years of land use permitting, environmental reviews, and literal physical construction.
Right, so the AI wants to move at the speed of light, but the copper wire required to power, it takes a decade to pull out of the ground in Chile, refine, ship, and install.
Exactly.
So if we imagine this entire global infrastructure as like a single connected train, the digital engine is a magnetic levitation bullet train trying to go 300 miles per hour.
I like that analogy.
And it is physically hitched to middle cars representing our global shipping and manufacturing, which are heavy freight cars maxing out at maybe 60 miles per hour. And dragging at the very back is the caboose, our energy and resource extraction, which is basically rolling on hand-cranked wooden wheels.
Yeah, and if those domains remain permanently coupled together, the physics of asynchronous acceleration dictate a catastrophic release of tension. The engines simply cannot pull the hand-cranked caboose at 300 miles per hour.
It's impassable.
Eventually, the couplings linking these domains will violently snap, or the tracks themselves will be torn apart.
And when those couplings snap, when that kinetic energy is released because the software demanded the physical reality to move faster than physics allows, that friction has to go somewhere, right?
Energy is conserved. It doesn't just vanish into thin air. The physical stress generated by that asynchronous acceleration is directly absorbed by the environment.
Wow.
Which perfectly introduces the text's second structural layer, chronic load redistribution in planetary systems.
Okay, let's break down that terminology. Chronic load redistribution. When I hear the word chronic, I immediately think of a medical condition that you manage, but you never really cure.
That is exactly the intended context. The text draws a very sharp distinction between acute crises and chronic conditions. If a region experiences, say, a severe hurricane, that is an acute planetary shock. It is violent, but it passes, and the local ecosystem eventually returns to a baseline state of equilibrium.
Right, it recovers.
But the text argues that the friction from our asynchronous technological train has pushed the Earth's physical systems out of the realm of acute shocks and into a permanent underlying state of chronic stress.
Because the technological acceleration never stops. The engine is just always pulling.
Right, and because the system is constantly under stress, the planetary environment is forced to dynamically absorb and shift that burden. This is the load redistribution part. The Earth is essentially acting as a massive shock absorber for the global economy.
Let's go back to the data center example, because I think that illustrates this perfectly. If an AI facility suddenly demands a massive amount of electricity, how does the planet physically redistribute that load?
It often comes down to water and heat. Data centers generate an immense amount of thermal energy. To prevent the servers from literally melting, they require massive cooling systems, which heavily rely on water evaporation. In places like the American Southwest, where many of these centers are built, millions of gallons of water are drawn from local aquifers or rivers every single day just to cool the servers.
So the load, the actual friction from the digital acceleration, is directly transferred into the local hydrological cycle.
Exactly. The local ecosystem has to dynamically redistribute its water resources. This stresses agricultural output, which then forces farmers to drill deeper wells, which further depletes the aquifer, which stresses the local flora and fauna.
It's a chain reaction.
The planetary load doesn't disappear, it just perpetually wanders through the ecosystem looking for a place to rest.
So what does this all mean for the planet fundamentally? Is it like a structural pillar in a skyscraper? Imagine a skyscraper supported by a grid of massive concrete pillars, and each pillar represents a planetary sink, like the oceans, the forests, the aquifers.
Yes, keep going with that.
If the asynchronous tech train puts too much strain on one pillar, say we heavily degrade a major forest biome, the physical weight of that skyscraper doesn't magically decrease, right? Gravity's constant.
The total weight of human infrastructure remains the exact same, or in our case, it actually grows heavier.
So the weight that was being supported by the weakened forest pillar instantly, physically shifts to the surrounding pillars. The ocean has to absorb more of the carbon load. The aquifers have to absorb more of the agricultural load.
Yes.
And now those surrounding pillars are carrying more weight than their baseline engineering allows.
Yeah.
So they start to microfracture. Eventually, one of them weakens, and the load violently shifts again. The planet is basically trapped in this permanent state of structural groaning, constantly redistributing the weight from one failing pillar to the next.
The skyscraper dynamic is an excellent way to visualize the interconnectedness of biomes. When the Amazon rainforest experiences severe recurring drought, a weakening pillar in your analogy, the global carbon cycle shifts its load to the oceans.
Right.
The oceans absorb the excess CO2, which increases their acidity. That acidity stresses marine ecosystems and coral reefs, effectively weakening a completely different pillar thousands of miles away. The Earth never reaches equilibrium because the asynchronous train is continuously adding more total weight to the roof of the building.
But here's the critical engineering question. If you have a skyscraper that is constantly shifting its weight and groaning under a chronic load, the internal architecture of that building needs to be incredibly flexible, right?
Absolutely.
The joints need to have elasticity. The steel needs to be able to bend without snapping so it can actually absorb the shifting stress.
You need a massive amount of structural slack. You need buffer zones. But, as the text reveals in its third layer, the human architecture responsible for managing our resources, our global economic infrastructure, has actively eradicated all of its structural slack.
Which brings us to layer 3. Brittleness. in global economic infrastructure.
And here we must make a vital distinction in material science. The text does not claim that the global economy is weak. It claims that the economy is highly brittle.
Weakness and brittleness are very different physical properties.
Precisely. A wet paper towel is weak. It cannot support a load. The global economic infrastructure is demonstrably not weak. It coordinates the daily movement of billions of tons of physical goods, routes trillions of dollars of capital, and organizes the labor of billions of people.
That's massive.
Under ideal static conditions, it has an enormous load-bearing capacity.
It's the difference between a dried twig and a fresh green branch. The dried twig might hold a lot of static weight if you just hang something from it, but the second the wind blows, the second there's an asynchronous lateral shock, it snaps cleanly in half. Our economy is the dried twig.
That's a perfect analogy. It shatters because it has zero elasticity. And the text points out that we purposefully engineered the global economy to be brittle in the relentless pursuit of a single metric, which is efficiency.
How does efficiency create brittleness? I mean, we usually think of efficiency as a good thing.
To maximize profit margins and keep up with the asynchronous acceleration of the digital world we talked about, corporations systematically removed all the slack from their operations. Consider the evolution of the supply chain.
Okay.
Decades ago, a manufacturer would maintain large warehouses full of spare parts. That inventory acted as a buffer. If a supplier had a delay, the factory could just pull from the warehouse and keep the line running.
That's the structural slack. It's a shock absorber.
But from a pure accounting perspective, a warehouse full of parts is inefficient. It represents tied-up capital that isn't generating a return. So the global economy adopted just-in-time logistics.
Right, just in time.
Algorithms calculate exactly when a specific part is needed on an assembly line in Germany, and a ship leaves Taiwan so that the part arrives precisely 3 hours before it is installed. We eliminated the warehouses entirely. We optimized the flow of physical goods to the microsecond.
We hardened the entire global system into this mathematically perfect, incredibly rigid structure.
It is an absolute marvel of optimization. But what happens when a hardened, rigid structure encounters an unexpected shock? What happens when the planetary load shifts, or a pandemic hits, or, a massive container ship gets wedged sideways in the Suez Canal?
Oh, wow. The 2021 Suez Canal blockage is the perfect case study for this, isn't it? The Ever Given.
It is the defining real-world example of economic brittleness. A single ship, pushed off course by a high wind, which is a minor environmental shock, blocked a single canal for 6 days.
Just 6 days.
In a flexible system with structural slack, a 6-day delay is a local inconvenience. Factories would pull from their buffer stockpiles. But because our global just-in-time system is entirely rigid, that one localized shock sent catastrophic resonance waves through the entire planetary economy.
I remember that.
Assembly lines in Europe shut down because they were missing a single microchip. Shipping containers ended up in the wrong ports globally, disrupting agricultural exports in South America literally months later.
The dried twig snapped.
It shattered cleanly. Because there were no buffer zones, the system could not bow to the pressure. It could only break. The text argues that we have built an astoundingly brittle glass economy directly on top of a planetary fault line that is chronically shifting its load.
So let's review where we are in this architecture, just to keep everything straight. We have a technological train tearing its own couplings apart because it's moving at different speeds.
Yep.
The kinetic friction from that train is dumped onto the planet, which constantly shifts its structural weight to absorb the blow. And the economic system we rely on to manage this whole process is a dried twig, prone to snapping at the slightest lateral shock.
Which leaves us with the most pressing question of all, honestly. If the technology is ripping itself apart, the planet is constantly shifting the load, and the economy is ready to snap, what happens to the human beings living inside the system? When the systems governing your daily survival are this massive, this complex, and this prone to sudden fracture, what happens to your perception of reality?
And that leads directly into the text's fourth and final layer, which is perceptual divergence in social systems.
This brings us full circle to the narrowing perceptual bandwidth we discussed at the very beginning, the IMAX screen. Because the global fields, the tech, the planetary load, the brittle economy, are far too massive for our biological brains to process in totality, our social systems completely lose the ability to maintain a shared consensus reality.
The text calls it divergence, which means splitting apart, moving in fundamentally different directions.
And I want to be incredibly precise here, because it is very easy to misunderstand the text's argument. This is not a political point. We are strictly analyzing the mechanics described here. Throughout history, human beings have disagreed vehemently on taxation, religion, governance, and morality. That kind of ideological disagreement is normal and expected.
Right.
The text is outlining a mechanical failure, not an ideological one.
Okay, so it's not that we are looking at the same facts and forming different opinions. It's that we are literally not looking at the same facts.
Precisely. The argument is that people are experiencing entirely different underlying realities. Because our bandwidth can only capture a tiny fraction of the widening global field, the specific fragment you perceive becomes your absolute truth.
Let's ground this with an analogy, because I think this is the layer that generates so much friction in our daily lives. This is like looking through a keyhole. Imagine a massive, chaotic, incredibly complex room. That room is the modern world, but you're not allowed inside. You're standing in a hallway, and you can only look into the room through a tiny keyhole in the door. That keyhole represents our narrowed perceptual bandwidth.
The restricted aperture of human cognition.
Right. Now imagine 3 different people looking through 3 different keyholes on 3 different doors leading into that exact same room. Person A looks through their keyhole, and the specific angle of their view happens to perfectly frame a comfortable, beautiful armchair.
Okay.
Based on all the empirical data available to person A, they conclude this room is a cozy parlor. It's totally safe.
A completely logical conclusion based on their limited data set.
Right. Then person B looks through their keyhole on another door. Their angle perfectly frames a roaring fire in a fireplace. But because the keyhole is small, they can't see the brick hearth or the chimney. All they see are massive flames. Person B concludes the room is on fire. This is a catastrophic emergency.
And panic sets in.
Finally, person C looks through their keyhole, and their view tracks a vicious, snarling guard dog pacing back and forth. Person C concludes, this room is a deadly arena. We are under attack.
Here is the tragedy of perceptual divergence. Mechanically speaking, all 3 of those individuals are telling the absolute empirical truth. None of them are lying. None of them are necessarily victims of misinformation. Their limited bandwidth accurately captured a real component of the global field.
The armchair is real. The fire is real. The dog is real.
But when person A, person B, and person C meet in the hallway outside to discuss what to do about the room, they will violently clash.
Right, because person A thinks person B is a hysterical alarmist for screaming about a fire.
Yeah.
Person B thinks person A is dangerously ignorant for wanting to sit down in a burning room. And person C thinks they are both fools because neither of them is preparing to fight the dog.
Exactly.
They will viciously argue over what is in the room because their perceptual divergence makes it physically impossible to see the whole picture. The keyhole limits the truth.
And let's map this directly to reality. How are those keyholes shaped in the modern world? They are shaped by the algorithms operating in layer 1. Social media feeds, search algorithms, and digital news aggregators are highly optimized sorting mechanisms.
Right.
Their primary function is to maximize engagement. And the most efficient way to maximize engagement is to identify the specific fragment of the room you are already looking at and exclusively feed you more of it.
So if person B spends 3 seconds looking at the fire, the algorithm says, great, here are 10 million more pixels of fire. It actively removes the armchair and the dog from their feed.
The technology actively shrinks the keyhole. It physically curates a bespoke reality for every single user. This means perceptual divergence isn't a glitch of the social media age. It is the core business model.
And again, to be super clear, we aren't taking a stance on the cultural fights themselves, just looking at the architecture driving them. But if society is trapped in this severe perceptual divergence, what happens to our ability to solve the massive systemic problems we talked about in the earlier layers?
It completely collapses. You cannot coordinate a planetary scale fire brigade if 1/3 of the population believes the building is safe and another third believes the real threat is a dog.
You just end up fighting in the hallway while the room burns down.
Which brings us to the final, most complex section of the text. The author doesn't just present these 4 layers in isolation. The true architectural blueprint emerges when we conduct a multi-layer synthesis. We have to map out the feedback loops between the tech, the planet, the economy, and society.
We need to see how these gears actually grind against each other. The text focuses on 2 types of feedback loops, amplification and dampening.
Let's define those in systems engineering terms. An amplification loop, often called a positive feedback loop, is self-reinforcing. It takes a problem in one layer and exponentially worsens a problem in another layer. A dampening loop. A negative feedback loop acts as a structural break. It mitigates or slows down the chaos.
So let's look for dampening loops first. If layer 2, the planetary environment, is groaning under shifting weight, the logical solution is to build stronger pillars. We need to transition the global energy grid, repair degraded biomes, and fundamentally restructure our resource extraction.
That is the necessary dampening mechanism. But consider what that requires. Planetary-scale structural repair demands immense patience, long-term capital investment, and most importantly, flexibility.
But layer 3 is the glass economy. It operates on just-in-time efficiency, it demands quarterly returns, it has absolutely zero structural slack.
Exactly. This is a critical interference pattern. The brittleness of the economy actively dampens our ability to fix the planet. If a major corporation attempts to build slack into their supply chain to reduce planetary friction, perhaps by sourcing sustainable materials locally at a higher cost, or paying for redundant, slower shipping routes, the global market will view that as gross inefficiency.
The market will punish them.
Yeah.
A more ruthless, brittle competitor will undercut their prices, and the flexible company will just go bankrupt.
The brittle economy structurally prohibits long-term planetary repair. The moment you try to bend the glass to absorb the planetary shock, the market shatters it. The dampening mechanisms are neutralized by the system's own design.
So if the dampening loops are blocked, what about the amplification loops? The text identifies one specific cycle as the most structurally significant feedback loop in the modern world. It calls it the doom loop of acceleration and decay.
This is the engine of our current historical moment. I want to trace the circuit of this doom loop step by step using the mechanics we've discussed.
Okay, let's map the loop. Where does it start?
It initiates in layer 1, asynchronous technological acceleration. The AI software engine suddenly spikes in capability, demanding an immediate, massive draw on physical resources and energy that the physical logistics cannot match.
Right. The bullet train pulls violently away from the freight cars, the couplings snap.
This localized snapping generates an immediate lateral shockwave that slams into layer 3, the brittle global economy. Because the economy relies on perfectly timed, rigid supply chains, it cannot absorb the delay or the sudden shift in demand.
The dried twig snaps. We experience a sudden cascading supply chain failure, or like an algorithmic flash crash.
To survive this sudden economic crisis, the system panics. It desperately attempts to reoptimize and recover lost capital. To do this, it squeezes the physical world even harder, forcing a massive, sudden load transfer onto layer 2, the planetary systems.
So the planetary skyscraper is forced to instantly redistribute the weight of the economic collapse. Mining operations accelerate, emissions spike to cover logistics failures, and another ecological pillar groans and cracks under the chronic load.
Now look at the totality of what just happened. The technology ruptured, the economy fractured, and the planetary baseline degraded. The sheer scale and complexity of this cascading failure generates a massive volume of alarming data.
The IMAX screen explodes with alarms, changing frame rates, and chaotic information.
And this vast influx of terrifying, hyper-complex data completely overwhelms our narrowing perceptual bandwidth. The biological brain cannot process the macro event. So layer 4 engages. We retreat into our algorithmic keyholes to find a simplified narrative. Perceptual divergence accelerates rapidly.
Person A blames the crisis on the armchair. Person B blames the fire. Person C blames the dog. Society fractures into millions of mutually hostile micro-realities.
And here is where the loop closes and locks in. Because society is now perceptually shattered and violently divided over the fundamental nature of reality.
We cannot coordinate. We are fighting in the hallway.
We cannot coordinate to pass legislation to reinforce the planetary pillars. We cannot coordinate to regulate or build slack into the brittle economy. And we absolutely cannot coordinate to slow down or synchronize the technological train.
This is like a four-way seesaw on a sinking ship. Every time one end crashes down, the vibration weakens the very deck it's bolted to, making the next crash even harder. And because we fail to intervene, the train just keeps accelerating asynchronously.
The digital engine speeds up again.
So in the architecture described by the text, which force is currently winning out? The amplification or the dampening?
The text's conclusion is unambiguous. We have constructed an architecture where the amplification loops vastly, overwhelmingly overpower any remaining dampening mechanisms. The system is structurally biased toward its own acceleration and the decay of our perception. It paints a picture of a system running incredibly hot.
Which means the next time the couplings snap, the shockwave hitting the glass economy will be even harder. The planetary load will be even heavier. And because the system is larger, our perceptual keyhole will feel even smaller.
The output of the crisis becomes the supercharged input for the next rotation of the cycle. That is the doom loop.
So if we look at this entire blueprint, it explains exactly why everyone feels so tired. You are actively trying to process a collapsing supply chain, a shifting climate, and an AI revolution. But your brain evolved to track the weather and local tribal dynamics over a 20-mile radius. We're trying to run planetary-scale diagnostic software on a biological hard drive built for a campfire.
That is the biological reality. And, understanding this architecture doesn't magically fix the system, but it is the prerequisite for any form of agency. You cannot navigate out of a labyrinth if you refuse to admit the walls exist.
Right.
By recognizing that your exhaustion is a product of structural perceptual decay, by recognizing the shape of the keyhole, you can begin to consciously step back from the divergence traps.
Let's summarize the immense conceptual ground we've covered today. It's been an intense journey for you, the listener. We moved from the overarching paradox of widening global fields and narrowing human perception.
Through the 4 layers: asynchronous tech, shifting planetary loads, a brittle economy, and a fractured social reality.
And finally, to the massive feedback loops tying them all together. Well, this text is highly theoretical. You are living inside this architecture every single day. Your feelings of exhaustion or confusion are a direct result of this perceptual decay.
It really is. And I want to leave everyone with a final lingering question that builds upon the source text. If we project this forward, if human perceptual bandwidth continues to narrow while these global fields infinitely widen, do we eventually hit an event horizon?
An event horizon.
Like a point where this entire architecture of technology, planetary strain, and economics operates completely in the dark, effectively becoming invisible to the human mind entirely. We become passengers on a machine that we no longer recognize as a machine.
That is a staggering thought to end on. If the architecture is becoming invisible, then deep dives like this, forcing ourselves to trace the blueprints while we still can, are more vital than ever. Thank you for joining us on this incredibly challenging journey through the mechanics of the modern world. Remember to keep questioning the architecture around you, be kind to yourselves as you process the noise of the widening fields, and keep looking for the edges of the keyhole. We will see you next time.